We'll be going
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the fifth in a series of FNO, Finance New Orleans Developer Webinar Series. As many of you know by now, we've recently changed our name to Finance New Orleans, and so it's FNO. I'm Valerie Robinson. I'm here with Lucinda Flowers. And as most of you know, we have been assisting and presenting these programs over the last several months. And we'll be working today with the Enterprise Green Communities criteria. Lucinda's an experience in affordable housing policy, advocacy, and communications. She started her own consulting practice 4 years ago, focusing on grant writing and communications.
And Valerie has owned, good morning, everybody, sorry. Valerie has owned Robinson et al. Marketing and Public Relations for more than 20 years. Her company offers a full range of communication services to clients in the private, nonprofit, and public sectors. And as we've said, this is a series of webinars that Finance New Orleans has been doing to inform the New Orleans development and building community, folks, large and small, about new sustainably focused direction, about their new sustainably focused direction. And we really want to get across the idea that Finance New Orleans is here as a community development resource for folks. And that we do our best to meet our partners where they are. So feel free, consider this a resource in the long run, so Valerie?
Today's session is an overview and will provide information about how certification for your project works. We want to leave time for you to make comments and get questions answered. So please, throughout the program, you can enter any questions or comments that you have in the chat box, and we'll answer them toward the end of the meeting. Now back to Lucinda to introduce our program for today.
Thank you. We are very pleased today to have 3 people from Enterprise Community Partners. The first one is Michelle Wetton, who probably many of you know because she's based here, who's the Vice President and Gulf Coast Market Leader for Enterprise Community Partners.
Thank you.
And then in DC, we have Kristenegger, who's Vice President of National Initiatives at Enterprise Community Partners, and Shelby ONeal, who's Associate AIA, and she's Senior Program Officer with Enterprise Green Communities. And this format is going to be kind of a mixture of presentation and discussions. Michelle and I are going to chat for a minute, and then Krista and Shelby are going to do a short PowerPoint. And then from there, we'll probably have more discussion among ourselves, and then also time for Q&A from the audience. So feel free again to type your questions into chat. So with that, we're going to start with Michelle. And I think Michelle, good morning, Michelle. She's going to give us the context. She's the local person. She runs the Gulf Coast office here, and she's going to frame this by giving us a sense of why it's important for the New Orleans development community to know about Enterprise Green Communities criteria. And as I've said, she's Vice President and Gulf Coast Market Leader for Enterprise Community Partners. Enterprise in New Orleans has invested over, or I guess the Gulf Coast, right, where over $400 million in loans, grants, and equity toward the production of 12,000 affordable housing units in the year since Katrina. I know they have been here since shortly after Katrina, I believe. She wears a few other hats here in New Orleans, past president and current board member of the Louisiana Association of Affordable Housing Providers, She's currently the chair of the board of Springboard for Two Opportunities. She serves on the Federal Home Loan Bank of Dallas Advisory Council, and here she's on the boards of Gulf Coast Housing Partnership, Providence Community Housing, and Reconcile New Orleans. So, Michelle, with those who are not familiar, why don't you kind of start with a quick overview, if you would, please?
Sure. Thanks so much, Lucinda, and thank you, Valerie. Enterprise is really pleased to be part of Finance New Orleans Developer Series, and specifically to be providing an overview of our Green Communities criteria. For those of you who aren't familiar with Enterprise, we're a national nonprofit. We have offices in several cities across the country, as Lucinda said, including right here in New Orleans. Many of you probably know my colleague, Monica Gonzalez, who I think is joining us today. Or also John Sullivan and Matt Morin are my other colleagues here in our New Orleans office. And we're supported by a team of national experts, two of whom you're going to hear from today. Our Gulf Coast office provides financing in the form of grants, loans, and equities to primarily support the development of affordable housing. And we also promote good affordable housing policies, and we work with a lot of the local and statewide advocacy organizations to do that. And we've worked with city and state housing agencies and many developers, probably many of you here that are participating in today's webinar, to incorporate cost-effective green building strategies into now thousands of single and multifamily properties since Hurricane Katrina. And we know that especially in this part of the country, where you live and how your house is built can have a real huge impact on your monthly bills, on whether your house floods, on how quickly you can return after a disaster, on the severity of things like childhood asthma, et cetera. So we're especially pleased to be working with Finance New Orleans. We're really happy about Finance New Orleans' commitment to green building and resilience, and to share the Enterprise Green Communities criteria, which is the only green building standard that's specifically for affordable housing. So that is, I'll stop there, Lucinda.
Okay, all right, thanks. Just briefly, we talk about criteria and certification. Is that certification for a developer? Is that certification for a project?
Yeah, so Green Communities is a set of criteria for specific projects. So an individual project would get certified, not a person. And as you'll see today, the criteria covers really all the stages of the project, from site selection to design to materials to building systems to operations and maintenance of that project.
Okay, and I think you've said, we were going to discuss this a little later, but I think it's great to touch on it now. You said that it's consistent with other criteria here in New Orleans, or other plans, such as the resiliency plan. You said with some work that Nora is doing, right?
Yeah, so different city agencies and state agencies have adopted Enterprise Green Communities for their affordable housing programs. So the New Orleans Redevelopment Authority uses Green Communities for some of their housing programs. Some of the elements of Green Communities are consistent with the new comprehensive zoning ordinance. For example, the stormwater runoff, which Shelby's going to cover, helps you be in compliance with the new comprehensive zoning ordinance. There are features in the Gentilly Resilience District that are consistent with Enterprise Green Communities. And then I think as it relates to Finance New Orleans' role working with the Louisiana Housing Corporation as the issuer of bonds for 4% tax credit deals, for those projects, there's a threshold requirement under the design features category that you have to meet the minimum standards for one of 4 green building standards, and Green Communities is one of the 4 options you can choose. So for those of you who are considering a 4% tax credit project. This is listed on page 14 of the qualified allocation plan. You can find green communities and the 3 other green building standards.
So I guess that touches a little bit on the benefits of compliance. Anything else that you want to highlight for the local folks about the benefits of becoming qualified?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say in addition to sort of the overall community benefits of lowering our dependence on fossil fuels and reducing our collective impact on the climate, as we mentioned, lowering utility bills, reducing the usage of toxic substances in our homes, lowering rates of asthma, it really can reduce flooding and the impacts of flooding, and reducing the negative impacts from storm and weather events, and allow you to return from a storm more quickly if your house receives less damage.
Great, thank you. So I think now we turn it over to Valerie and Krista and Shelby.
Yes, so as Michelle mentioned, we have national experts from the national office, and we have Kristenegger and Shelby ONeal with us today. Shelby is the Senior Program Officer for the National Building Resilient Futures Initiative. And that's part of the national nonprofits focused on housing supply, advancing racial equity, and building resilience. She has several years of experience in this work, and she's practiced sustainable architecture and design, holds a Bachelor of Science in Sociology and Political Science from James Madison University, and a Master of Architecture from the Catholic University of Architecture and Planning. So she is here to talk with us today, and she's going to actually give the presentation along with Kristenegger, who is the Vice President of Green Communities for Enterprise Community Partners. And she's got more than 15 years of experience. She works in climate disaster response, cultural resilience programming to deploy equitable resilience solutions across the country. She's been involved in all sorts of programs and is on the Network for Energy, Water, and Health and Affordable Buildings Advisory Council, Oberlin Enviro Alum Steering Committee, and the Building Performance Institute Board of Directors. So they come well qualified to talk to us today, and I'm going to turn it over to them for the actual presentation.
Thank you so much, Valerie. I'm very happy to be here to talk with you all about green communities today. Thanks for the warm introduction. So my name is Shelby ONeal, and I'm sitting in Washington, D.C. today. I'd just like to orient us before we dive into how our presentation is designed today and what we hope you'll leave with after we go through this topic. So Valerie, if you wouldn't mind moving the slide, great. We'll provide a high-level understanding of the Enterprise Green Communities criteria, and specifically the 8 criteria categories of the 2020 criteria, our newest version. And we'll also do some reminders and providing awareness of the timeline and processes for certifying to the 2020 criteria, which is very much similar, if not the same, as certifying to previous versions. And also equip you with knowledge for locating online resources to help support you and your project teams as you approach certification and utilize the 2020 criteria. So thank you, Valerie. Great. Michelle gave us some context for Enterprise today, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but as Michelle shared about our mission, really the Green Communities platform is an example of the work of enterprise, the broader work of enterprise. And in this work, we're showing that green affordable housing really changes lives, and it's essential and achievable as part of enterprise's overall mission. Next slide, please. Last year, actually, we were able to celebrate the 15-year anniversary of the creation of Enterprise Green Communities. The program was designed in response to feedback from you all, actually, from the affordable housing industry, with the understanding that there was a gap in the market and barriers to building green affordable housing. So what I mean by barriers is really, for example, capacity barriers. So when there's already so much on the plates of affordable housing developers, how do you implement these practices? And cost barriers, of course, there are perceived and real cost barriers that we're all aware of, and institutional barriers. So the lack of policy incentives and programs 15 years ago, like Michelle just mentioned, Green Communities is referenced in the qualified allocation plan for tax credits. And this is one way in which we've been able to really successfully collaborate with developers. So these are just examples of the environment that Green Communities was born out of. And our purpose from day one and still today is to green all affordable housing in the country through programmatic work designed to solve for these barriers that prevent people from living in housing that's healthy, efficient, and durable. Next slide, please. So here's our impact map. You can see that light blue states include projects that are underway or certification, or projects where, states where they're actually certified projects. And the darker blue indicates places that we have a relationship with the policy on the ground, including requirements or incentives in qualified allocation plans for LIHTC credits. And you can see, of course, that Louisiana is nicely colored in our dark blue. So this is intended really to illustrate that we're well on our way to achieving the goal of greening all affordable housing. And again, much of our success has been through partnerships with great groups like Finance New Orleans and city and state policy advocacy. Next slide, please. So the criteria is really a tool that defines green building for the affordable housing sector and provides strategies to achieve health, resilience, and sustainable project goals and outcomes for residents. But certification, on the other hand, is a process where there's third-party verification for projects that successfully adopt the criteria. And as I said, the most recent version of the criteria is the 2020, which was rolled out at the end of last year in 2019. So now all new projects submitting for pre-build will follow these updated strategies and processes for green affordable housing. Next slide, please. For those familiar with the 2015 criteria, we're focused essentially on similar, if not the same, 8 categories for holistic and human-centered approach to green building design and development that all include building and programmatic strategies to deliver your goals. The program is still designed in 2020 to accommodate all different project types as well. So within these categories, there are various pathways depending on whether your project is single family or multifamily or low rise or high rise, or located in a rural area or in a city or suburb. And of course, if you're working on a rehab or a new construction project. So we'll now transition into a high level overview of the 2020 criteria throughout those 8 categories. And beginning with integrative design, thanks Valerie. This is really, in many ways, the backbone of the criteria. So from resilience to water and health and performance, really whatever your project is focused on, integrative design is the key to meeting your project goals. We know that implementing integrative design process can determine the success of a project. And this is only more critical in 2020 as the affordable housing sector reaches for more durable, more resilient projects with, greater performance and health benefits for residents and communities, all while maintaining project budgets, right? So the concept and general objectives of an integrative design process are the same in 2020 as previous iterations of the criteria, which is really engaging in a holistic approach to pre-design by prioritizing information gathering and the resident and surrounding community experience, setting goals for building performance and resident health and comfort, and encouraging buy-in and accountability for project team members. And what's different is that we've amplified our focus on integrative design with our new version of the criteria, and provided in many ways new activities and requirements in effort to support teams in engaging in a meaningful integrative pre-design process. So one significant example of this I'll go into on the next slide is a new comprehensive activity and tool, the Project Priorities Survey. If you could move to the next slide, please. Thanks. So the Project Priorities Survey is in line with Criterion 1.1, outlines this requirement, which is mandatory for all projects. It is intended to help teams establish that holistic understanding and context for the project, including the population, the community, the assets in the neighborhood. And all of these things shape the priorities that impact decisions about the project and garner support for the project. So for instance, when completing this exercise as part of the 2020 criteria, you'll be asked to determine what community assets are nearby that you should consider in your project. And you can research that through the Opportunity 360 tool. Excuse me. And we're also introducing through the Project Priority Survey a baseline vulnerabilities and risk assessment to inform the project's resilient design priorities. And this is just scratching the surface at resilience assessment for the 2020 criteria, but is an integral part of that pre-design consideration. And so the PPS, which we affectionately call it now, it really is a significant update, going beyond the type of information we were looking for teams to share with us in previous iterations of the criteria. I'm not able to dig in deep to all of these subsections of the survey document now, but I do encourage you all to familiarize yourself with the concept and check out the survey on our website. And I'm actually going to go ahead and just paste a link in the chat. And later on in our discussion, we'll be able to orient you all to where resources live, including this. So we know, by presenting this new requirement, we do know that we're asking for a little more here, but it's all guided towards informing your integrative design so that it's meaningful and encourages the success of your project. So let's go ahead and move on to location and neighborhood fabric. This is our category 2. most of the criteria, in this category were updated in a minor way from 2015. And you'll want to review this section, all the ways that site and services can impact residents and the environment. I will say there's more consideration in the 2020 criteria given to rural projects with respect to location and their unique needs. So it might be applicable to projects of yours. But really, what I'll focus on as one example in this category is that as we are living day to day, the increasing impacts of climate change, it's critical to conserve natural resources, protect ecosystems, and reduce flooding while we're developing affordable housing. So in light of this, the 2020 criteria includes more specific requirements for limiting development to curtail impact on sensitive land features, but also to mitigate climate threats to new development and residents. Next slide, please. So to frame this work as part of the 2020 criteria, we're designating these sensitive lands, that ecological resource protection zones, or ERPs, if you will. And we're asking teams to develop with a sharper focus on these 4 ecological features. And with these in mind, we're asking teams to document them in a new way with an ERPs map opposed to a site map. So if there's a feature on your site per the criteria within these buckets, we'd ask you to develop a map. And here's an example that is really intended to serve as a communication tool to enable clear understanding of the project site by documenting specifically the boundaries of the site and the relationship between buildings, site boundaries, any ERPs, and other contextual elements that help communicate site conditions. Understanding the ecological features on your site at the start of the development really enables more sensitive development practices. And in a way, more broadly, by framing this conversation, we're encouraging awareness about ERPs and sensitive land features in the long run. So next slide, please. We'll move on to category 3, site improvement. In a similar vein, looking at our site, but really the immediate site here. This category has largely remained consistent between the 2015 and 2020 criteria, but I'll just touch on one exception to this that Michelle alluded to earlier, is our stormwater management criterion. Next slide, please. This criterion was optional in previous versions, and there is now a mandatory requirement for new construction projects and certain rehabs to implement surface stormwater management. And we're doing this a little bit differently than we did in 2015. Although we're asking teams to retain and treat runoff in the same design sort of strategies, we're looking for a different amount, and we're looking to measure it in a more specific way. So definitely check this out in the criteria. Also note that there's a scale for earning additional optional points once a project meets the threshold for the mandatory requirement. There's also optional points available. Next slide, please. Great. So moving on to water. Speaking of runoff, something really, I think, significant change from 2015 to 2020 and how we are talking about water. And for example, I'll share a statistic that though lead pipes were banned in new systems in 1986, according to the American Water Works Association, 1/3 of water systems included lead service lines still in 2016, just a few years ago, which to me is really remarkable when you think about it. We know that there's no safe level of lead exposure. And so in 2020, we're focusing on water quality, which really impacts health. And through this criterion 4.3, the water quality criterion, we can move to the next slide, please. We're asking projects that have lead service lines to replace them and test water for levels of known toxins and bacteria, and certain projects at risk of Legionella to implement a management plan to mitigate that risk. So in addition to, preserving this natural resource, we want to preserve our residents' health. So focusing on the quality of water is critical in the 2020 criteria. Next slide, please. Great. So moving into operating energy, in the United States, residential and commercial buildings account for 40% of energy consumption and significantly contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. The 2020 criteria prioritizes the reduction of emissions by new strategies and a new plus level of certification focused on pushing investment in deep levels of energy efficiency, which of course is critical for our changing climate. Next slide, please. We're now framing our building performance criteria in 2020 around this path to zero. There are 3 critical strategies as part of the path to zero. The first is reducing a building's operating energy through energy efficiency practices. And then through the type of energy source, that's also critical, that fuels the operating energy. So potentially introducing renewables. And then another element, reducing a building's embodied emissions. So what's in the materials that are used to construct the property from an emissions standpoint. This category in 2020 is primarily focused on those first 2. And I'll just briefly talk through this diagram intended to illustrate this path to zero. So on the far left, you may be familiar with our 5.1 mandatory building performance standard. 5.1A and 5.1B represent this mandatory standard for all projects. New construction projects will follow 5.1A and certify to Energy Star through pathways available within Energy Star's program. Rehabs will follow 5.1B and meet a certain threshold of either whole building performance, either through ASHRAE or following an ERI path. Both of these criteria are focused on reducing energy consumption. What's new for 2020, those are familiar, generally a little bit different in the technical pieces, but the pathways are generally similar. What's new as part of the process is we're also, in light of looking toward zero, we're asking teams to report out on their energy use intensity, and we're offering a number of new templates to help you calculate this and share this new information with us. So when we get to resources, I'll highlight where to find those, but there'll be a little bit of a new process with respect to certification. So from 5.1, projects then choose how far they'll go on the path to zero by further reducing energy use. In 5.2, including renewables, are going electric through these criteria in 5.3A and 5.3B. And then, as I mentioned, actually, teams that are able to go all the way to zero energy through 5.4 and near zero certification, excuse me, that's where we've introduced our new certification plus level. So if a project is designed to near zero or zero energy certification, it'll receive the highest level of certification. So there are optional ways to reduce project emissions and energy consumption. And this is just a really broad overview of this category. So to encourage you to read it more closely in the criteria. Next slide, please. Great. So recognizing that we're all exposed to chemicals and building products that make buildings we occupy. In the 2020 criteria, like the 2015, there are numerous measures available, both mandatory and for optional points throughout this category to minimize resident, staff, and builder exposure to harmful chemicals with negative health impacts. Next slide, please. The 2020 criteria brings a new approach to healthy building materials, which is focused around transparency and optimization for avoiding chemicals of concern, and goes beyond maybe more traditional ways of reducing VOCs by now lifting up third-party verified labels and enabling teams to avoid legacy contaminants and recycled materials. I'm just giving a snapshot of some of these key criteria in category 6. The first 3 are new, they're optional, and they provide opportunities to build awareness of how to actually push the building product sector forward within material impact. And then 6.4 and 6.5 include mandatory measures about selecting materials that are healthier for residents. So a lot of pathways within category 6 to go deep into materials. Next slide, please. So as I just mentioned, health is a theme that you'll see throughout the 2020 criteria, and specifically in category 7, there are new strategies that we've incorporated to sharpen our focus on health. But I will say that a number of the traditional ways that we've looked at creating healthier living environments through managing indoor air quality and promoting health through design. A lot of the criteria in this category are tried and true, but there are some differences, and I'll just highlight one that I think is significant. Next slide, please. So while we included a smoke-free policy as part of the 2015 criteria, you know, we know that secondhand smoke is associated with so many adverse health effects. So in the 2020 criteria for projects certifying, the policy is now required, or it's required now to include a smoke-free policy in building common spaces. And so that piece is no longer just optional. There is an opportunity to expand your smoke-free policy to individual dwelling units for optional points. Just want to highlight that. And moving into the final category 8, operations, maintenance, and resident engagement. You know, this is that piece of sort of translation from the developer contractor to who's actually living and operating the building. Absolutely critical for executing all of the design strategies that you've spent so much time considering for your project. So in 2020, the approach generally the same. No new criteria, no criteria that we omitted. There are a couple of updates in each to account for other areas of the criteria that we're lifting up. But I'll just reference utility benchmarking as where there's one change I think is significant. So next slide, please. We've revised our approach in response to sort of best practices that are happening in the utility sector. And out of this, we are providing a pathway for compliance that doesn't require tracking individual unit utility consumption or energy usage and utility usage. So I think that's a big one. There are a number of new methodologies to enable different types of projects to comply with this criteria. We'll next just take a couple of minutes to talk through how we're certifying to the 2020 criteria. Before we go, I want to mention one thing that I didn't bring up before. That's just another added feature of the 2020 criteria overall. Is a automatic co-certification with the Well Building Institute. So projects that achieve certification to the 2020 criteria will also automatically receive certification to Well. And there's more information about that on our website, but that's an exciting partnership for this year. So how to certify. This certification process here is kind of a nice overall guide to the steps of certification. Really, the timeline is generally the same as it has been, while the content's different. The steps of certification are familiar if you've engaged with certification before. So pre-build is the pre-construction application phase that's due prior to the start of construction, hopefully 30 days prior or more. That's where you share with us how your project is intending to comply with the mandatory criteria and meet the optional criteria necessary for certification. Post-build is that post-construction verification of how your project implemented the intended strategies. During both phases, there's certain pieces of documentation that we'll look for to support what you share with us in your application. And our review process is similar. So for both pre-build and post-build, our team will receive your application in the online portal and we'll review it within 30 days for new submissions and any re-reviews that are provided. We still have our formal waiver process when teams confront really extenuating circumstances that prevent them from meeting a mandatory requirement. We're still working closely with teams to work out solutions, and that process is housed within the online portal in your project application. And we're still here to work closely with you throughout pre-build and construction and post-build. And so do rely on us as you have before. One thing that's new that I do want to highlight is we're now collecting just a fee with your submission at pre-build and post-build, one per each phase, regardless of the number of re-reviews. And there's more information about that also on our website. So next slide, please. I keep referring to resources, and here we go. So with all of the new content and some new processes, we have a lot of new tools to support you, which we're really excited about. So we've created a new 2020 criteria website where we hope that teams will go to plan, to review resources, to collaborate with teams. There are a number of, usable and functioning checklists that you can use to identify how your project will meet their goals. There are ways to filter requirements based on project type. On this side menu, you'll see if you go through the criteria on the actual website, there's the checklist with an abbreviated version of the criteria that's you can manipulate and print and share. And then there's the full manual. We have the addenda and FAQ now updated in real time and woven into the criteria. So there's no need to look at different resources to ensure you have the most up-to-date information. And all of the requirements for documentation are included on the templates for certification page, where all of the templates required also live. So it's really a one-stop shop, which we haven't had before. And it's just really fun to use and we're excited about it. So I encourage you to dig in there. And this is sort of your one-stop shop planning resource. Next slide, please. But a reminder is that all applications must be submitted in the online portal. So compiling your documentation and reviewing and submitting, and communicating with our team about the status of your application all takes place in the online portal. And let's see, I think that brings us to near the end here. I'll just highlight also that, sorry, next slide, please. We've polished our website so that we're keeping partners like yourselves up to date on all events and webinars, program resources, and just hope that that'll be easier to navigate now. So do encourage you to visit both our green homepage here, our 2020 website, and the online portal to help support you through engaging with the 2020 criteria. With that, I mean, I think we've been able now to orient you a little bit to the 2020 criteria throughout all categories, touch on some key highlights of significance in the 2020 criteria, and kind of remind us all about general timelines and processes for certification. So thank you for listening. I think we may go into some Q&A now.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Shelby, so
Go
much.
ahead.
Valerie, okay, I'll go ahead. Sorry, guys. We're scattered according to, COVID protocol these days. So, and I'm not sure who this is for, but perhaps for Krista. Are there different differences in the criteria for different parts of the country? And specifically for the Gulf Coast, are there specific things that we deal with here where others do not, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks for asking, Lucinda. There's only one version of the Green Communities criteria. So regardless if you're in New Orleans or Alaska or California, it's the same program with the same standards. But there are differences that are included in the criteria for like rural projects versus urban ones. For instance, urban projects have more requirements around like being connected to transit where rural don't. And there are differences also between new construction properties versus rehabs. You just can do a lot more when you're starting from scratch with a new construction building. So there are differences like that. But otherwise, there are different mandatory criteria in every category that Shelby went over. And then there are also optional criteria in every category that Shelby went over. So, depending on where you are, who the residents are that you're housing, and what's important to you, you would pick different criteria. And, some of the practices that y'all in New Orleans do on a regular basis show up as optional criteria. So you can get points for doing floodproofing, for instance. And we have a whole slew of disaster resilience focused criteria, and that I think would make a lot of sense for projects in the city.
Yes, we are. We do know our disasters down here. Yes.
Yeah.
That was one of our other questions. How are these criteria consistent with the city's resilience strategy? I know you talked about NORA and, some other things, but I mean, the city has a whole, resilience plan. And I mean, does it all fit together nicely, or?
I think it's.
Oh, go ahead, Krista.
Was that Michelle? Go for it.
I was going to say that adopting green communities for your affordable housing project will certainly help you be consistent with the city's resilience strategy. The city is focusing a lot on infrastructure, but they also are encouraging affordable housing developers to incorporate green building strategies into their new affordable housing, and certain affordable housing programs that, especially those that NORA is operating, and now that Finance New Orleans is operating, are specifically adopting green communities and other green building strategies. So it's definitely consistent. One of our favorite success stories with green communities in New Orleans is was NORA's neighborhood stabilization program, through which about 10 nonprofits worked with NORA to redevelop hundreds of vacant and blighted properties across the city, building new single-family properties, all of which were built to Enterprise Green Communities, the previous version of the Green Communities criteria. And now there are hundreds of new homeowners who have energy efficient, resilient new homes that are also, another benefit is they are built more durably. So building systems won't have to be replaced as often. So the maintenance is less expensive as well for those homeowners.
Great, thank you.
I think we touched on this, but are there any more differences that you guys want to highlight between the 2020 criteria and earlier years?
Yeah, we've really, with the 2020 criteria, added a bigger focus on driving down carbon emissions so that we can slow down the pace of change that our climate is going through. We've also really amplified the different strategies and the criteria that have to do with making homes healthy for the people that live there. We've broadened our approach to water. So like, as Shelby mentioned, it's not just about how much water you use now, but the quality of that water. And then we've strengthened strategies around resilience. So I think those are the big things.
Okay, I think we have a few questions from the audience. Lucinda, you want to take those?
Wait. Okay, they're not showing up. I don't.
They're not? Okay, I can't, yeah.
I don't have anything in chat, sorry.
Okay, I thought I saw a couple.
If anybody has some and we're not seeing them, please go ahead and type it in. I just don't see anything in my chat
Okay.
box.
Well, I think most of the answer that we got, most of the questions answered about, how to start the certification process. I think one question was is there a minimum size of a project where you wouldn't have to go through the certification project?
There's no minimum or maximum. So we've done everything from like single family homes to scattered site developments with lots of single family homes to mid-rise multifamily and high-rise multifamily. So as long as there's some affordable housing in the project, I'd be happy to work together on that.
All right, and what are the, I kind of have two questions. What are the big costs involved in certification? And also it's sounding like, I just want to reiterate this, that it's judged by a point system, right?
Yeah, that's right. So there are required items in each of the 8 categories. And then if you're a new construction project, you need to get at least 40 optional points, or if you're a rehab, at least 35 optional points. But you can pick how you want those to play out. I think the most significant item in some ways of the whole criteria when it comes to cost and when it comes to how you're designing your building and how you'll be talking with your trades on site is the energy efficiency criterion, because you do need to work with an energy consultant to do an energy model up front to give you an idea of whether or not the way that you've designed the project is on track to use a lot of energy, not use a lot of energy, meet the threshold that you're shooting for, so that when the building's actually completed, you can be really confident that you've met it. You don't want to wait till the end to consider, oh, should I have added more insulation in these walls? Because that's just really expensive to fix at the end. So working closely with our HERS rater is the kind of term that they go by, but an energy consultant early in your design process can be really beneficial to make sure that you don't have to have expensive change orders later on. But that energy efficiency piece, I think, is the crux.
Okay. Just, Valerie, you want to do the last question or me? Which one?
About the certification process.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, that's why I put this, I mean, it's on your website, I know, and then also I put all of y'all's emails up here for anybody looking at the screen. So I think you can get in touch with any of these people and they'll help you through the process.
All right. And so this is who you contact. And we've talked about other resources. I see Krista has maybe typed in some information on this, and we can, it's available both through Enterprise, and then if somebody wanted to contact Finance New Orleans, I'm sure Finance New Orleans could put you in the right direction. Do we have any more? I'm not seeing any more questions. Anybody else?
Well, we're like just right on time here today, so that's a good thing. So just want to thank everyone for coming, and we will have our last session of 2020 on December 4th with the New Orleans City Planning Commission to talk about a variety of things that may affect people developing. They've got some new guidelines for a variety of different things. So in the meantime, stay tuned for 2021 and have a happy Thanksgiving.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a great weekend.